The first step in the mold making process is to set up your model on a base. We begin this operation by laying out the parting line on the model. The idea here is to separate the model in two distinct halves, which will become the two distinct halves of the mold. Take your time here, as it is much better to figure out how you're going to separate the mold before you start building the parting line. After we have completed laying out the parting line, our next step is to set the model on the modeling board and block it in using small wooden blocks. Now the idea behind this is to actually save ourselves some time and effort in laying out the parting line on the model with the blocks. What this does is it reduces the amount of clay that we have to use going around the model, and thus reduces the amount of time we have to spend on building the parting line. Use as many wooden blocks as you can, gluing them in place using your glue gun, and get as close to the parting line that you've drawn as possible. This will really save you a lot of time in claying in the model. Setting up the parting line on the model is the most critical stage in developing a good two-piece mold. Using soft oil-based clay, we work the clay over the blocks going around the model and build them up to a level just about at the parting line or just exceeding the parting line. After this step, we then begin flattening out the clay to produce a nice, even parting line. This step takes a long time to do, and you really need to take your time at it because it is critical. Laying out a good clean parting line will ensure a mold that separates easily and produces an excellent finished product with little flashing to clean up. Initially, just concentrate on getting the parting line set up nice and even. You will take care of the outside edges after you have the parting line nice and clean. After we have built the basic parting line, smoothing it out with our fingers as best as we can, our next step is to use small sculpting tools to define the parting line and make it nice and smooth and even. Take your time, smoothing out the parting line. Use whatever kind of tools you have available and whatever it takes to get a nice tight 90-degree lock of the clay wall to the model. This is a very slow process. It is very important to make sure that you have a 90-degree parting line to the edge of the model. If it is not at a clean 90-degree edge to the model, you will end up with flashing on the mold when you try and put the two halves together. Make sure your parting line is nice and clean. Any loose clay will create a rough surface in the mold and may end up giving you problems when you're joining the two halves of the mold together. We are now ready to key up our model for the molding process. Using acorn nuts, which are readily available at any hardware store, placing them around the model into the clay, this will create a locking surface for the two mold halves. It will also make sure that they align perfectly together. As you can see, we use quite a few keys here. Basically, as many as you can fit into the clay is the amount that you will use. We're now ready to box in our first half of the mold to get it ready for pouring our silicone. Using foam board as a wall, we score the surface of the foam board so that we will be able to bend it and make it conform to the edge of the model. Sometimes it's useful to have an extra pair of hands helping you. Sealing the parting line to the foam board is critical in ensuring that you do not have any silicone seepage. Doing this in stages will make your life much easier, as once the foam board is completely around the model, it's harder to get into the little cracks and crannies of the parting line. When you're gluing down the foam board, please ensure that you have sealed it completely and securely. If you do not do this, you will have silicone leakage and have a lot of problems in the molding process. Be generous with your glue. Again, take your time in sealing the clay to the foam board. You really do not want to have silicone seepage underneath the clay, as this wastes a lot of rubber. After we have sealed the foam board with our glue gun, it is necessary to take additional steps to make sure that there is no leakage. Using duct tape, modeling clay, and basically anything that you might have available around to seal the mold walls and seal the foam board down, do everything you can and take all the time necessary to make sure that you have no leaks. It's better to take extra time and overdo it than to underdo it. Our final steps in preparing the model for pouring the silicone on it is to add vent tubes wherever is necessary to make sure that there is no air trapped in the casting process and ensuring that we will have a complete casting with no bubbles. You can use whatever material you have lying around the house to create your vent tubes. Our final step is to spray mold release over the entire model. Even though we're using silicone which doesn't stick to anything, adding a mold release that is designed for silicone mold making will ensure that the mold demolds nice and easily. We are now ready to mix up our silicone rubber for the mold making process. Using a large bucket, we add the silicone rubber and after weighing it out, we add the appropriate amount of catalyst to the mix. Our next step is to make sure that the silicone base and the catalyst are well mixed together. When the color is completely even, the rubber will be ready for de-airing. De-airing the rubber is critical in producing a good silicone mold. During the de-airing process, the rubber will rise and fall numerous times. After the final fall, where it stays down at the bottom of the bucket, bubbling away, you must allow this to continue for at least an additional 2 minutes to make sure that all the air is removed. When you pour your silicone rubber over the mold, it is critical that you pour it in a thin stream. Start in one spot and stay in that one spot and allow the rubber to flow over the entire mold. Take your time and do not dump the rubber into the mold box. We are now ready to begin demolding the rubber that has been poured and cured. Take your time in breaking apart the mold box. There's no need to rush here, and you want to make sure that the rubber does not separate from the model, as we still have the second half of the mold to pour. It is critical during this time that you work carefully and slowly so as to not separate the rubber from the model. Peel away all the clay very carefully. It should come off fairly cleanly, with minimal cleanup required after its removal. Use your sculpting tools to pop out the keys and remove the clay. After the rubber has been completely cleaned off from all the clay, it is time to make the second mold half. Using foam board again, we cut a piece to the correct height, score it, and then place it around the first half of the rubber mold. Again, in gluing down the mold box, take your time to make sure that it is sealed completely. After we have sealed down the mold box, it is then time to make sure that there is no leakage between the first half of the rubber mold and the edge of the mold box. This is done by using the soft oil clay again to fill in the gap. Work your way around the entire model to make sure that it is well sealed. As we did before in sealing down the first mold box, put a layer of clay all around the base of the mold box after it has been sealed with a glue gun. Take all steps necessary to make sure that there is no leakage of silicone. Your next step is to spray the mold with a mold release that will act as a separator between the two halves of silicone rubber. This must be a mold release that is not affected by silicone. We now repeat the process of mixing and pouring the silicone rubber again. We take our time, fill the bucket, add the correct amount of catalyst, mix it completely so that there is a homogeneous mix. And after that, de-air it in the vacuum chamber. Remember that while you're pouring the silicone rubber over the mold, you should pick a low point in the mold box, pour in a thin stream to that low point, and allow the rubber to spread out over the surface of the mold. This will eliminate any possibility of trapped air creating bubbles in the silicone rubber. Do not try and rush this process. If you do, you'll end up with trapped air in the rubber. Allow it to take its time to slowly pour over the entire mold. We're now ready to demold the mold out of the mold box. Once again, the foam board should peel off fairly easily from the silicone rubber. Very carefully then, peel apart the two halves of the mold. The keys will keep everything tightly locked together. Work your way around the model, trying to break the seal between the rubber and the model so that you can pull it out. After you've removed the model from the rubber mold, it is then time to cut out any vents or pour spouts. Your mold is now ready for its final cleanup and pouring, creating an exact duplicate of the original model. Your first step in the casting process is to spray the mold with a lacquer-based barrier coat. This protects the mold from reaction with the chemicals used in the casting process, and at the same time gives a base coat of color for the finishing process of the casting. After the mold halves have been sprayed with a barrier coat, they are joined together and then held together using band clamps. This is a good way to prepare your mold for casting and ensure a tight seal between the two halves. Use enough band clamps to make sure that the mold is sealed equally and evenly all along its entire edge. After placing the mold in a plastic bucket to hold it upright, we then mix our casting resin. We are using a fast cast resin that uses equal parts of part A as well as part B to create a proper mix. Make sure you have enough resin on hand to pour the casting in one continuous pour. Also, please be very careful that you use equal amounts of part A and part B of the casting resin. This is a 1-to-1 mix by volume casting material. Make sure you mix the two components very thoroughly. Even though this is a fast casting material and you have to move quite quickly, mixing is critical to produce a good casting. Try and pour the casting resin in a thin, even stream, starting at the lowest part of the mold and letting it flow up over the entire surface to produce a casting with minimal air entrapment and minimal finishing work. As casting resin cures, it changes from a clear to a white resin cast. It is now time to demold our casting. Undo all the band clamps carefully and then remove them from the rubber mold. Pull apart the two halves of the mold to reveal our finished casting, which has a base coat of black primer coating most of it in preparation for our final finishing. Because the mold is keyed so well, you can see the flashing is very thin and is easily removed from the casting. One of the great things about reproductions is that you can create any look that you like. In this case, we are spraying the casting with a base bronze metallic coat and then dry brushing on an antique metallic wax, giving it the look of a bronze casting. Only by lifting up the casting itself will someone be able to tell the difference between that and a casting made out of real bronze.